Hello and welcome to Choose Up Phi. Today on the show, we have longtime Phi community member JT Olmstead here. And I actually met JT this Memorial Day at Camp Phi Mid-Atlantic. And we had just an amazing conversation. And I knew I had to get him on the podcast. It's interesting because my biggest financial failure is in land speculation, which I've documented many times here on the podcast. And in a fascinating turn, JT is actually a land investor. And he's built this amazing business with incredible systems. And I was fascinated. And I almost actually just stopped the conversation and said, all right, I want to go in as like a white belt to the conversation we have on the podcast. So I stopped it there and we're picking up today. So this is going to be fantastic. Welcome to Choose Up Phi. JT, I'm so happy to have you here. This should be fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. So you are, like I said, a longtime Phi community member. I dug up an email because when we met at Camp Phi, I said to myself, when I heard your last name, I'm like, I know you. I know you for years from the Facebook group, we've emailed a couple of times. And I dug up our original email and you left us an iTunes review in August of 2017, which was essentially at the very beginning. And I've subsequently learned that you found Mr. Money Mustache way back at his beginning in 2011 or thereabouts, just as you were starting your career as an IT network engineer. So talk me through the origin story of JT way before the real estate. There was JT, I'm in IT and I'm thinking about Phi. Like, let's go through that.
Yeah, at the very beginning, I started off really just trying to save money. I grew up with relatively frugal roots. And so I stumbled across Pete over at Mr. Money Mustache when I was just looking for an article, trying to how to save money. I think I was on a car at that point. I'm like, oh man, this commute is killing me. How do I make it cheaper? People are talking about biking. Some guy mentions this crazy article from this dude called Mr. Money Mustache. And I was like, but that sounds a little out of the box, but let's just see what he has to say. Consume that first article and think, this man is a genius. I need to know more about what he's saying, right? And then I consume all of it. And I go into what my wife affectionately kind of refers to as these rabbit holes, that we go down. So I start doing this thing where I'm pacing the room and waving my arms animatedly and telling her all about how we're going to change our life and save all the money and it'll be amazing. And how this concept speaks to my soul, how I can be free through financial discipline.
That is awesome. I'm picturing you. One of my favorite shows of all time is The West Wing. And there's this just funny scene of Josh standing outside. And it's like, why is Josh Lyman gesticulating wildly out there? And so I'm picturing you doing that with your wife. And I think we've all been there with these rabbit holes. Finding Phi is I don't know, it's that awakening moment. I feel like for so many of us man, there has to be something better. There has to be something different than just going to work for the next 40 or 50 years and essentially spending all your money for today. And I think we all find Pete in a different sense. It's funny you found him, I guess, with bicycles. I found it. I think the shockingly simple math was my awakening moment. But actually, that might have come out after you already found him, possibly. I'm not sure on the exact dates on that.
Yeah, it really is amazing how you can stumble across the right bit of information, the right perspective, that covers a topic that maybe you've heard before. But for whatever reason, in that moment, in that time, it just awakened or gave voice to something in my soul that I didn't really know how to articulate. And it just started pouring out. You're like, oh man, this is it. This is what I'm looking for.
Yeah, that's great. So, okay, at that point, you were just getting started with your career and making money for the first time or significant money for the first time. Where were you immediately prior to that? So Mr. Money Mustache, day -5 or something. Where were you in your financial journey? Did you have a financial journey or was it just, hey, I'm doing my thing. I'm making some money for the first time. I'm spending it all kind of deal?
Yeah, I was fortunate that when my wife and I got married, we were early 20s, pretty young, but we were both pretty financially disciplined just by nature and nurture. And so we got married, we're getting started, and I was still kind of finishing up school and starting a career at the same time, trying to do both. And we're paying our way through school. We're doing all these things, right? We're trying to just scrape our money together and be super frugal because we didn't really have any. And it was right at that point where I had just transitioned to a proper job. I just right around that time had just gotten a legitimate, went from kind of the part-time work to a full-time position. and my income had significantly jumped. And I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with all this money? It was so much more than I was used to having. And, in retrospect, it was just a starting point, but it was so big at the time. And so we were trying to figure out like, well, how do we save? And we should be investing, and, just all these different ideas were running through our head. And this space, this movement, like helped us kind of put a framework in place about like how we were going to move forward on that.
Nice. So did you two sit down at that point? So obviously you're married fairly young, but you're on the same page, which is
Yeah.
wonderful. I mean, that's the tough part for most people. And it sounds like you, like you said, through both nature and nurture, you were maybe ahead of the game in that regard. But did you and your wife sit down and have conversations at that point of, hey, what are we doing this for? What are our goals? What's enough? Did that happen at that point? Or was it just kind of, okay, let's save X% of our income or some such?
Yeah, at the very beginning, it was just like, all right, now we just need to save like 99.7% of our income and we'll be retired in 6 months or whatever,
Nice.
But, so we started looking at the math and realizing, well, we can't save all that much. That's kind of impossible. So how do we come up with a realistic number? And, it really just raw data, raw numbers at the beginning, trying to figure out like how much can we possibly save and how long will it take? And if I do these projections for the 47th time, maybe it'll get better. That was a lot of our conversation at the beginning. And then it slowly evolved into what you're talking about. Like, okay, well, we're saving money and we're on this steady path, and our vision for our future continued to evolve, because in the subsequent years, I have 4 children, and over the subsequent years we were having those children. And so like as that happened and as life progressed and things changed, we like slowly our vision was shifting, and we had a lot of conversations over that time to kind of bring us to where we're at today.
Interesting. So, yeah, it's funny because I feel like a lot of us talk about having these conversations. And I think like sometimes they actually happen. And sometimes they're more just an in theory of, oh, I think we're on the same page. But it sounds like you guys actually had these conversations as your lives were evolving and as kid number 1 turned into 2, 3, 4. Can you think of anything offhand? And I know this is a lot to ask because it's years ago at this point, but can you think of anything offhand that may have changed from that initial version of how you conceptualize FI to maybe what it was after a couple kids versus maybe where it is today even?
Yeah. So not to jump too far ahead, but if I think back to JT pre-Fi and then JT post-Fi and the subsequent years after, pre-Fi, my goal was to make, like, I remember distinctly sitting at a kitchen table with some friends of mine and vocalizing, man, if I could just make $100,000 in 1 year, I would be like set for life. Like I would be so well. I just can't even imagine making that much money. It was just like so beyond my expectations at the time. Then like as we progressed over time, then I realized like I reached that milestone and thought, wow, this is great. I'm glad I'm here. But actually I don't know that this is really like the top end of my capabilities, right? Like, is this really, that was the summit at the time, but now there's more summits, right?
Yeah.
And like, it's always a struggle to determine whether it's like you're pushing yourself because that's what makes you happy, or because like you're just not satisfied with everything in life, right? You're like, oh, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? So it's always a struggle to determine between those two. But over the years, I've had those moments where I looked at where I was at and looked at where I wanted to go and determined like, okay, have I reached that yet? Is this the final spot? And I think that there's never really a final spot the more I learn about it. And ultimately, as I've kind of continued to develop over time, I've like, I want $100,000 or $200,000. I have these different spots that I really want to reach for my goals. And then last year, let me step back. In the beginning, the goal was to retire, live on $40,000, $50,000 a year and be set for life. But it became clear over time that that's not actually what I wanted. That's what motivated me from reading Mr. Money Mustache, was thinking that's what I wanted. And that's what got me, going and focused. And that I love that. But last year I was at the Chautauqua in Colombia, and I was sitting down and I was thinking, what do I really want? Like at this point, it's just last year. So I'm thinking, what about my businesses? How are they doing? Like, am I working too much? I'm just trying to determine like, where am I at? I like to take those opportunities to really like check in with myself and see like where I need to go. And it became super clear to me that all the years before I had been focused on trying to get to a number that I could retire with, or to a place where I thought I'm going to be, all the money I'll need, more than enough, happy to go. But it became clear in that moment that I actually didn't really want to retire.
Yeah.
I love the game too much, and I just want to keep like playing it, right? Until such time as the game is no longer fun, right? Like that is when I want to stop or change games. But getting to that ultimate point of retirement just kind of dissolved away. Like that was no longer what I wanted.
Wow. Okay, JT, there's a lot there. And I think this is really important to slow down on, right? Because there's so many intersecting ideas here. And I think the evolution of FI, both on a micro personal level and maybe on a macro community wide level, has been really interesting to see, right? Because I think many of us, when we got into the concept of financial independence, it was about, okay, I'm going to race to that number. I'm going to race to, and it might have been a fairly small number. Like, I need $30,000 or $40,000 a year to retire. I'm going to hit my 750K to $1 million in liquid net worth, and I'm going to ride off into the sunset. I think that's very alluring at the beginning, but I find very few people that actually stop there. And it's not necessarily like you're saying, I love the game too much, and you want to just keep playing until it's no longer fun. I think that's really the kernel of truth amongst virtually every single person I know in the FI community is these are all people who had the wherewithal to reach financial independence, right? Like in many cases, decades earlier than a normal retirement age. They're not just going to stop and sit on the beach and sip these silly umbrella drinks. Like that's just not plausible. It's just this horrible caricature, and it's just not true. Because, like I said, to have the wherewithal to get to FI so many decades earlier, you have to be really interested in the world, in learning things, in testing things out, in trying new businesses, in earning more income and negotiate all of these things, right? Like it all goes hand in hand. And to imagine you're just going to hit some number on a spreadsheet and wrap it up and ride off into the sunset is just like, it's really silly. And there was one thing in there you said that I found fascinating, the top end of my capabilities. And I'd love to hear you dive into that more because that's a very intriguing statement. Have I reached the top end of my capabilities? Do I want to reach? Is it, it's all again part and parcel of what I just talked about for the last minute or two. Like, talk me through that because that intrigued me.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I do at this point, and really if I look back, I didn't realize it, but historically it's been the same, is I'm always trying to determine what do I want to do? Kind of a couple different things. What do I want to do? What do I think I should be doing, both like personally and like, what is the Lord? I'm like a faithful guy, right? So what does the Lord want me to do, right? And then what do I think will like benefit my family and society, right? So like, there's a couple conflicts. I'm always thinking like, is where I'm at now the place that I ultimately need to end up, or am I on the right path to end up there? And whenever I think about throttling back or changing course, I'm always asking myself, is this the best I can do? Is this the best possible version of myself? you know, and the goal I set, is the goal going to get me to the best possible version of myself? Am I pushing myself to the greatest extent possible? And not to the point where I want to burn out over it, but to the point where I think, man, because by the time I die, I want to be like the best JT possible. And that's it, and that's the end. Like, and if I'm not continually moving forward, I feel like I'm moving backwards. I feel like I'm just going to stagnate, right? And so I'm always trying to like push myself in different arenas, whether that's professionally or personally or whatever, financially, whatever the arena is, to kind of move forward on different fronts. And I don't know, I think for me, it really is all about what am I capable of and what can I imagine? And I'm continually lifting my vision on that, like in almost year over year, sometimes day over day, recognizing that where I think I can go is probably not the top. It's just a top I can imagine now. And down the road, I will realize there is a greater version of me available if I just want to work for it.
Yeah. I love the concept of I want to be the best JT possible, in essence, like you said, before you die. But do you think there's a danger of continually moving goalposts or it almost turning into a hedonic treadmill for maybe not the normal way that it works with buying fancy stuff, but this moving the goalpost type of hedonic treadmill?
100%. That is the darker side of that coin, right? Where you can continue to push yourself to be better, which is, in my opinion, a great pursuit. However, like you said, it can get out of control sometimes easily out of control, where you recognize, maybe I should just learn to be content with where I'm at. And I think that in different parts of my life, that is the right answer. In some parts of my life, it's like, I need to be content with what I have and where I'm at. And in other parts, it's time to push. I can't push on all fronts all the time. Like, that's not possible. I've tried it. It didn't work, right? Like, it just doesn't, it's just not successful. So I've realized that some parts I have to just be content with where I'm at. And then perhaps in a different time, in a different season, that will be the time to push forward there. But for now, I need to be happy with where I'm at there, and I can push on other areas of my life.
Yeah, I think that concept of enough, and I think in normal the connotations are money, right? But it's not just limited to money. Like you
Right.
said, you tried to push it on all fronts and you found out pretty quickly it didn't work, right? Like it's easy to say, oh, I'm at financial independence or I'm well on the path or whatever, however you conceptualize yourself. And oh, I have all this time. And that's true, obviously, to a degree, but you're still limited to essentially 16 waking hours a day. And when you have a thriving business where you can theoretically take it a million different ways, when you have a spouse and in your case, 4 kids, when you have health to consider. And I know we met at you've talked about now multiple in-person events, like travel, all of these things. Like there has to be some point of enough. And obviously I'm not saying this to you, I'm saying this to the audience because it's so important that like just because you have a lot of time, it's still pretty easy to fill it and you have to make choices. And I think sometimes saying no is one of the hardest things in life, but it's the most critical. And I'm curious, like, can you think of any examples of where you might have said no to something that sounded great or that the prior JT from 5, 10 years ago would have said an unquestionable yes, but it's just kind of like the strike zone is a little smaller. As Chad Carson said, like the buy box is a little smaller right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love Essentialism by Greg McKeown. It's like a yearly read for me, right? Because my natural inclination is to push everything. And so I have to remind myself continually that that's not the way to do it. And so I love Essentialism. I read 4,000 Weeks recently, also a great kind of similar concept. But, those books help me like recenter and realize like, wait a minute, just because I can try and do everything doesn't mean like that's the right move. So a recent example, going back to actually the Chautauqua I talked about, when I was having this kind of evolution of thought, trying to determine where am I at and where I want to go. At the time, I was running 3 businesses. And I was like, I feel way too stretched thin. Like I am a mediocre husband, a mediocre father, a mediocre business owner. I'm like just mediocre everywhere because I'm trying to do too much crap. And that made me realize like, I can't live like this. I'm unhappy with my own performance. And like, that's a problem because I've never been satisfied when I feel like I'm just mediocre everywhere. And so in that moment, I realized I had to shut down one of the businesses. And a business I had just started with a year before, and it had the potential to be $1 million a year business. It could have been a really good business. But it became very clear that if I continued on that path, I would continue to be mediocre because I was juggling too many things. And so I had to go back and I was in this business with partners. So I had to go back to those partners and tell them, I'm sorry, we've been working on this for a year. I have to leave. I can't do it anymore. If I continue on this path, you're just going to get a mediocre version of me. And I'm not okay with that.
Wow. Good for you. That's remarkable to actually be able to do it. Because I think for me, it's like how I find this showing up in my life is, yeah, I think I'm a little more discerning in terms of like my current time, but I still have some of these things that have the mental baggage. Like, for instance, my original websites, Richmond Savers and Travel Miles 101 specifically. Like, I still am frustrated to this day that I've kind of let Travel Miles 101 atrophy because it's a fantastic site. It really does potentially great things for a lot of people, but because of all the time I had to spend on Choose a Buy, obviously this is a labor of love to put it mildly. I just don't have the time for TM 101, and it's still there, and it still weighs on me mentally. But I just can't bring myself to shut it down or sell it or whatever it may be. And that's amazing that you'd be able to do that. Like with something that was so fresh. That makes it even more impressive. And I'm curious, like, what did your partners say when you came to them? Were they shocked?
They were a little shocked. I mean, they weren't jazzed about the idea, obviously, but they eventually understood it. And since then, that was probably almost a year ago now. And since then, they've come back around it and kind of recognized, they understood, like, okay, we see more and more, we understand why you did that and how it's kind of helping improve the other aspects of your life push them to the best potential, right? Like this was holding me back from being the best JT. So I was like, I'm sorry, guys, this got to go.
That's cool. Yeah, that is a great frame for how to kind of just approach life. And it's interesting because we're going to talk real estate here in a couple of minutes, but I just recently had Chad Carson on, who I just mentioned a minute ago. He just put out a new book called The Small and Mighty Real Estate Investor, and it's phenomenal. And I love his concept. It's almost like how I'm picturing it is you have this scale from left to right of, in his case, all of his properties. And if he's thinking about, okay, which is the one that gives me the most trouble, headache, stress, etc., that's the one I'm going to cull next, even if it returns a pretty good income. And maybe 5 years ago, this might have been my best property. Well, now, because I have to update my thinking, right? Now it's the worst. And that's got to go. And then that potentially opens me up to buy another one based again on that tiny little buy box of, I know it needs to fit these criterion because I can be discerning. And I think it sounds like you're approaching that in potentially all aspects of life, which is just a neat mindset.
Yeah, that's definitely the goal, and it is very much a work in progress. But that's where I'm pushing to be. Right, it's where I continue to have to remind myself of the importance of this, because I easily fall prey to the creep where it's like, oh, this would be good, and this would be good, and this would be good, and then I have way too many just good things and not enough like really awesome things on my calendar.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that. Obviously, I'm not trying to put you up on a pedestal as a paragon of virtue here with this, but it sounds like your head's in the right place. And listen, all of us fall back. I think that's really important. There is nobody who's perfect on any of this stuff. Like it's like entropy almost, right? It just devolves unless you're really, really overtly conscious of it. I think that's just something for all of us to keep in mind is, look, you do the best you can with the life you have and you try to be better. You try, as you said, try to be the best JT possible, the best Brad possible, whoever it is that, insert your own name, obviously. But that's not to say that life is unicorn and roses all the time. It just isn't. So we do the best we can, certainly. But JT, that was awesome. I really appreciate you diving into that. Sometimes with these conversations, they're so wonderfully free flowing. You never know where you're going to get into. And obviously, we're going to talk about real estate a lot here. But I think just like always here on Choosify, the mindset is just so critical. I think it is like 90% of success. The nuts and bolts of money, it's just not that hard. I mean, obviously there you can get into more interesting stuff like you certainly did. But for most of us, the nuts and bolts of money, it's just not that hard once you have it set up and it's on autopilot. But it's this stuff. It's the mentality. It's the getting on the same page with your significant other or spouse. It's trying to figure out what you want life to look like. All of those things. Like that's the real heart of this.
Absolutely. Definitely paramount.
Yeah, I think it really is. But for this conversation, the real fun part, and this is what I've been looking forward to now for 3 months, is all right, let's talk about your real estate investing because there is something super cool here. And let's rewind all the way to the beginning because I think where you started with real estate investing is not where you are today, certainly, but we all have an entry point. Let's start there.
Yeah. So in the beginning, I started out listening to Bigger Pockets, like I suspect a lot of people do, just trying to soak up some knowledge. And the only reason I really got serious about Bigger Pockets was because whenever I would do my modeling for retirement, because I wanted to retire as soon as possible, I would do the math and I would say, okay, if I just 100% stocks, was this 100% bonds, and what's the mix? And then I thought, what if I mix in some real estate? And so I started to model in real estate options in there. And it looked a lot better. All of a sudden, it seemed like it was faster, more achievable, less cash required. I was like, ooh, anything that shaves a few months off my retirement time is critical. So I started to figure out, how do I do this? How do I make this a reality? And in the beginning, I thought I was going to get into single family. And then eventually that evolved into, I want to get into commercial space. And I started off actually buying a very small office on the west side of Phoenix. And that office complex was really like my first introduction to real estate in general. And it was
office complex.
I was like, let's start with an office. That's a good idea. Spoiler alert, it's not a good idea. Don't do it. But I jumped into this office. I didn't have a business in it. It was like half empty. I was like, I'm going to turn this thing around. It's going to be amazing. It was not amazing. And when all was said and done, 2-ish years later, I had lost $100,000. So that is not my recommended approach for your first real estate investment. That was a bad call. But what it did do for me, was it like broke that barrier. And I thought, okay, I am now a real estate investor. And I started self-identifying as a real estate investor. And as a real estate investor, I should be looking for other real estate investments. And I stumbled across land as a potential real estate investment avenue on the Fire Drill podcast back in like mid 2018, Q2 2018. And that space sounded so good because the guy that was on the Fire Drill podcast at the time, I've later learned was kind of a guru in the space. He teaches a lot and he's very optimistic on how things will go. And so he's quoting like 300 to 1,000% returns. And you're like, that seems a little extreme, but maybe if it's on the low end, it's not crazy. So eventually I kind of dove into it, determined that he probably wasn't the one I wanted to learn this from, but Seth Williams over at RE Tipster was the person I wanted to learn this from. Not only was he a member of the Phi community, which I loved right off the bat, but he's legitimately, and I've learned in subsequent years, just one of the like best guys to know ever. He's just a really good dude, and he'll just give it to you straight all the time. And so he has a fantastic course, and that's what I took. The same course, it's obviously been updated since, but the same course back 5 years ago. And that's kind of what broke me into land as an investment vehicle.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Again, there's a lot there. So 300% to 1,000% seems, quote, a little extreme. That's
Yes.
probably a
Yes.
fairly discerning heuristic for investing. That's amazing. Yeah. So, well, obviously, we will dive into what might be more plausible for this land investing, because I suspect it's a lot higher than, like, I have my own back of the envelope heuristic for normal investing, which is if something, and again, this is not a hard and fast, this is just a general rule, but if something is saying that it's going to return more than 10 to 12% a year, my spidey sense goes up of, okay, there's more risk here than I'm otherwise aware of. And now that's not to say that something returning 9% has no risk at all, or
Right.
8%, not saying that, but it's just that general back of the envelope kind of concept of, okay, you have to be aware because returns don't grow on trees, essentially, right? Like there's no free lunch, and there's usually some level of risk that you're unaware of. So clearly, I think 300 to 1,000 might have, that was probably a good one. But I wanted to stop real quick on that identity statement. So even backing up, I don't want to go past this office complex too fast because there's something there. But the I'm a real estate investor, I think that actually surprises me very pleasantly in your case, because I think a lot of people who were sitting being a IT network engineer decides to buy an office complex out of nowhere, loses 100K in a year or two. And most of those people I suspect would like turn tail and run and never invest again. Whereas you said, proclaim loudly, I'm a real estate investor. Like, what gives there? Do you have any sense of why you did that?
Yeah, I will say there's probably two factors there. One is just a general proclivity to say, like, if I see a bunch of other people successfully doing this and it went badly for me, it's probably because I screwed it up.
Mhm.
So that's one. But two was the timeline. When I started the office, I bought the office complex in 2017 and kind of finalized everything very end of 2017, beginning of 2018. And then it was mid 2018, while I was still in the midst of the office complex, that I found land. And so it was the overlap that by the time it all finished and I realized what had happened with the office building, I had already begun a successful engagement in land. And then I could clearly say, like, okay, so maybe that didn't work, but this is working. And there's no reason I shouldn't keep doing this.
Oh, that's cool. I like that. So, did you have a sense pretty early that the office complex was going sideways or maybe south, and you pivoted into land, or was it just at that point, like you said, you're open to being like a learning machine in essence, and you're just trying to learn from bigger pockets, learn from RE Tipster. Like, was that where you were at the point? Like, how did you pivot from office to land so seamlessly like that?
Yeah, so really they ran in parallel for a while. And part of it is that with commercial space in general, you are typically relying on the agents you're working with to help get the space leased up or to have contractors redo some work. So you're typically more and more leaning on other people. Unlike single family real estate where you can kind of get in it yourself if you feel so inclined and like do a lot of solo work, that's less and less viable or sometimes not legal to be done on a commercial space, depending on the arrangement. So by its nature, you have to step back and be patient. And so it wasn't, I didn't realize for quite a ways, probably about a year before I realized this is not going well. And I need to figure out how to make it go better, So that timeline of the optimism, right? Where it's like, this will be fine. It just takes time. It'll be okay. That allowed me the space to kind of step back and say, like, okay, while this is happening and this will probably be okay, let's keep working on land as an alternative, and another potential investment avenue where I can continue to like keep growing this real estate venture.
Gotcha. Okay. So you're obviously an analytical guy. You talked about like the different modeling on retirement, which I think is probably more than a lot of people are doing. And hey, can I update this for X% is going to be real estate? And so clearly there's math going on here, right? There, I suspect there are spreadsheets with this office complex. I'm sorry, because I don't want to move past the office complex. It's just like,
Yeah.
it's so intriguing. Okay. When you bought it, it sounds like much of it was vacant, but Had you run the numbers on like, am I going to have it like a cash flow negative if it stays the current vacancy? What happens when it fills up, or even 75% full, or some such like were you just not able to rent it, or were there additional circumstances?
Yeah, so digging in a little bit more here, the office, as I noted, was is pretty small. So there were two primary spaces in the office. One was occupied by a dentist, which was a problem when COVID hit, and the other it was unoccupied, just an open space. And so from the beginning, it was vacant, and it was me trying to find the right tenant for that space, along with the agent who helped me work on this. And that work ended up being more difficult than I initially anticipated, obviously, right, in retrospect.
Right.
And finding the right, sourcing the right tenant, finding the right person to put in there was also a little more challenging than I thought. So as I look back over it post-mortem and kind of realize like, how did this go? And like, what went wrong? I can identify a few key items where it was like, oh, I was probably a little too trusting here. And that's because I just didn't know what I was doing, right? Or I was like, I miscalculated some things here because I overestimated or underestimated or whatever, right? The numbers were, and that really came down to like how much it was going to cost to do some of the work, how long it would take to get someone in, what the ultimate value of the building would be. And at the very end, I ended up selling it. Basically, it was completely vacant at that point. The dentist had moved out. And it was really like, I just sold it as a building, completely empty, to someone who just wanted to buy their own building because it was small enough to do that. And so that's it. In the end, that's where it ended up being, which is why it was kind of, I'm holding it all this time, not really breaking it, kind of losing money continually through the whole process. And then at the very end, come back to me.
Gotcha. It's funny that the concept that poker player and author Annie Duke talks about, which is resulting, right? It's sometimes very easy to look at the result, in this case, a negative result, and say that it was a bad decision from day one, just by definition. Now, it may have been a bad decision on day one. Like that's for you to have decided. But I think this is what's important for the audience to take away. Is like sometimes good decisions turn out poorly because maybe in this case, COVID hits, and obviously you couldn't have foreseen that. And then the dentist probably stops paying rent slash moves out at the end of their lease. And now you have a fully vacant building, right? So sometimes things are beyond your control. But like you said, there probably were some things that based on a little extra knowledge, okay, maybe it could have turned out a little better, but that doesn't by definition mean the decision was bad. So anyway, that's a longer conversation for another day. But I'm curious how the intersection of your financial independence journey and your real estate journey kind of worked here, in the sense that a lot of people don't have money to put down on a building or to buy land, or they're leveraging to the absolute hilt and they don't have enough. Let's say if the cash flow is negative every month, they might not have lasted a year or two. So I'm obviously kind of extrapolating here, but I'm curious, like, how does your financial independence journey play into the beginnings of this real estate, and then kind of as we move into the more successful land investing?
Absolutely. I think that transition was from the focus being financial independence to the focus being business where it is now. If I had not laid the groundwork with the financial independence process, like mastering my financials, increasing my saving, and kind of building up a solid nest egg to work from, it would have, in my opinion, been largely impossible. I would not have been comfortable transitioning like I did, because ultimately when I cut over from a good paying tech job to that, we had been living well below our means the entire time. And in fact, after I quit my job to run my businesses full time, we further cut our expenses, to just make sure we had a lower starting point for all of our regular expenses. But if I had not had years of savings in the bank where I knew like I have time to figure this out, I would not have made the transition. I just couldn't have done it. Like emotionally, I knew that like the only way I was comfortable even trying it was because I knew that I had years of savings if things went bad. And that like, if for some reason I made a horrible decision and it all falls apart, then that would be okay. Because I would have set my journey back a bit. I would have learned a lot, and I could go back to figuring out what I had done before. But those people who basically say I have $10 and a dream, like I just can't do that. Like I will not survive in that. An emotional state would just be a wreck. Right? I knew I had to have that base to work from, to know like I've got the wiggle room to get this wrong for a while. And truthfully, I did when I started. I screwed it up for like a year.
Yeah, it is. It's amazing, that power of FI, right? And in your case, you had years of savings. And like you said, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen? In essence, you go back to being in IT engineering, right? Like that's the
Yep.
absolute worst case is you go back to your normal life where everything was rocking and rolling. And I'm sure knowing you, you would have learned something else and would have dove into that. So I mean, there's no absolute worst case scenario here, which I think is most people catastrophize to a large degree. Even those of us in the FI community who we have those savings, we everything's going great. We're still hesitant. I think a lot of us are maybe a little too conservative when it comes to that. But I actually wanted to dive into, you said you cut your expenses with the transition. So transition, I guess, from having your full-time career to then being out on your own. And again, we're jumping forward maybe a couple years because we're still in the, okay, you're just getting started with the land investing, but I didn't want to go past this. So I think having those plans in place, right? Like, what does my life look like? How can we give ourselves a little more runway, right? You had years of savings probably at your current spend, but then when you lower that spend, then it potentially multiplies, right? The number of years of savings gives you more runway. How did you think about that? And what did you actually do in practice? Was there anything significant?
Yeah, as for us, when I finally made the cut over in April 2019, just finished my job, wrapped that up, and started full time on my businesses, I needed some headspace to like detox, obviously, in the transition. And during that time, I had another one of these moments where I took the time and the space to really reflect on where I was at, where I wanted to be, and like what our trajectory was. And it became clear in that reflection that where we were at was okay because we had enough savings, but that where we needed to be wasn't that spot. And for us, that was like physically and mentally. So we, at the time, we lived in like a 3,700 square foot house, and like we were like way too much space. And
Yeah.
we realized that after buying the house. We were there for a couple of years and we realized this is too much for us. And that combined with like this shift where our income significantly changed, went from a good steady income to like nothing for a while. We were like, this isn't where we need to be. We need to be somewhere else. So we looked around because we live in the east side of Phoenix. We looked around the different areas and we moved cities. And ultimately I worked with a friend of mine, set a watch on this, the houses around and said, okay, I want a house that is 4 bedrooms under this price point and has a rentable guest house. Right. And so we basically said, okay, we're going to do that. So what cropped up on the market, as soon as it cropped up, we knew it was what we were looking for. We made an offer and we ended up purchasing it. And this was mid 2019. Mid to late 2019. And that house, we went from the 5 bedroom plus a den or, like 3,700 square feet
Yeah.
down to like the livable space is like 1,300 square feet. So we significantly dropped the size of the house, added a guest house, which we immediately rented out. We basically cut our housing expenses by like into like a third of what they were before easily. Or less really, by probably a quarter if I think about it. And so we like just significantly dropped the expenses overall because we knew that was one of our core expenses, the most inflexible expenses we had, and that we didn't want to be in a position where if the businesses took longer to get going, or if there was some challenges we faced where we needed the additional money, we had saved to use for the business, that we didn't want to feel stressed. I didn't want to be in this perpetual state of discomfort. I'd rather be in a house that is a bit smaller, but a lot more comfortably financial.
Damn. Okay. That is quite a change. That's amazing. So, right, you essentially cut the square footage by 60% plus had a rentable unit at this new place. And yeah, I mean, cut 60 to 70% of your living expenses, which as we know for most people in their budget, that's 50% of your life expenses. And you did this with, I assume at that point, maybe a family of 6. I don't know how old your youngest is, but either 5 or 6 at that point,
Yeah.
into a 1,300 square foot house and made it happen.
Yeah, and we're still here today, and our income has significantly skyrocketed past where it was at the time, and we'll still be here for a while. Like we came to realize that it was like divine inspiration to move here. Like we feel like this is where we should be. Like this is the location we need to be today, and we'll probably need to be for the next couple of years until we feel inclined otherwise.
Wow. Yeah, that's super cool. So, okay, it sounds like we may have jumped ahead about a year, give or take. So, as I understand the timeline, you bought the office complex in 2018 sometime. You found land investing also in 2018. And then you said April 2019 is when you made the transition. A couple months later is when you bought this new house. So, I mean, JT, this all went down pretty darn quick, right? So, like, you're in the middle of this potentially negative office. I wouldn't call it a debacle because it doesn't sound like it gets to the level of debacle, but you could probably argue it. But yet, essentially 12 months later, you've left your job, you've moved. How do you get there?
Yeah. So once we started land, And I had some pretty early success right at the beginning in 2018. I sent out some letters, and because we primarily market through direct mail, and we got a really good deal right off the bat, and that both like gave me the confidence that this would work and that I could do it, right? And that success did not continue for the following year, basically. But it did give me a good jump start. I realized, oh man, this can be done. I can do this. If I do this correctly, I can turn this into like a proper investing style. And I like to say that when I first learned about land, I thought I was learning to invest in land, like a true like passive investment. And effectively, I was tricked into starting a business. I did not realize that's what I was doing. But after I got started, after about 6 months, it became very clear that what I was doing was actually running a business that just happened to deal in real estate. It didn't really matter. It could have been selling literally anything. I often say, like, if I was selling rubber ducks, that it could be the same thing. It just happens to be the land is a better vehicle for this. But it's really a business model that I run at this point.
That's funny. So, right. And we will get into this, but that business model, whether it's rubber ducks or vacant land, is it just you're buying lower and selling higher? I mean, is that like at its absolute essence? Is that fairly close?
That's effectively it. We source off-market deals and work with customers who prefer convenience and speed to price. It's people who are just like, I don't care. It's not the highest price. I just want this to be really easy and really fast. So we just optimize for that. We work with people who that's their preference, which was hard for me to wrap my mind around at the beginning because I'm all about price, right? But there's a lot of people in the world who just aren't. That's just not their number one thing. And so they don't optimize for that. They optimize for other things. So we specialize in that. And that gives us the profit margin to run a profitable business. And so we go through that and bring them immediately back to market for new users to go in and own and work with.
Huh. Okay. That's really interesting. Right. So, like you said, direct marketing. So I think that's mailing out letters or postcards in your case. And for
Yes.
anybody who owns vacant land, they know that they get a lot of these postcards.
Oh, yeah.
Like I said in the intro, I've documented many times that I have a full on debacle on my hands with one of my earliest investments with this land that I own in a golf course community in North Carolina. And I still, to this day, a couple times a year, get a little postcard from somebody essentially saying, "Hey, anytime you want to sell, we'll take it off your hands. Here's our offer." And sometimes it's literally written on the postcard. Sometimes it's call this 800 number or go to this website. Or obviously, you are very familiar with this because you send out, I assume, hundreds of thousands of these, or maybe millions potentially of these postcards. But yeah, we'll talk about that in a sec. But just the very last thing, I can't skip by this, which is you basically said this first deal was proof of concept, right? You said, quote, "This would work and I could do it."
Yeah.
And I think that's so important for people. I know I had that personally, again, with my tiny little site, Richmond Savers, and doing free travel rewards coaching where I was making probably, I don't know, $800 to $1,500 a month. Like it was nothing. It didn't come even close to my income, obviously, but that was on a half hour, an hour a day. It's like, oh, okay. I've actually proved this out to myself in my own brain. I may not have proved it to my wife. I may not have proved it to my friends, but in my own head, I proved it. And it sounds like that very first deal proved it to yourself.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Just getting that early success, I think looking back was critical for my confidence to do this model, right? And yeah, I think it was, yes, it was quite a blessing to be able to land a good deal right at the beginning. But, just to give you some comparison, at the beginning, I sent 500 at the time postcards. We do different models now, but I sent 500 postcards at the time. And I got one really good deal out of those 500 postcards. That today is unheard of. But even then, it was just pretty good luck. And because immediately once I sent that and I had that one deal and it went well and and things were going well, I went, oh man, I'm just going to 10x this. So I proceeded to send 5,000 postcards
Okay.
2 or 3 months later, and I got 0 deals, 5,000 postcards. So that was the humbling moment, right? Where it was like, okay, so that wasn't some pure genius on my part. Okay, I understand. Like it was statistics and some blessings, and that's how it came together. But I knew that it worked that one time. So I knew that if I did it correctly, and I saw other people successfully doing it. So I knew it, like they're doing it. I successfully done it once. I know I can figure this out.
Interesting. So, right, just like you said, statistics, just small sample size luck, right? You sent out 500. Had you sent out 10,000, 20,000, you may have gotten that one. And
Right.
that was maybe a more appropriate sample size, but any 500 out of that group could have conceivably gotten you that one deal. But
Absolutely.
that's for a statistics 101 class, maybe with someone actually knowledgeable teaching it instead of me. But nevertheless, that's kind of how the concept works. Okay, so let's actually talk about this. So you sent out these first 500 postcards. How do you get the post? Like, how do you know what to offer? How do you know how to do this? Like, are there databases? Are there, like, if you're sending them out, are 10,000 other real estate investors in the same database? Like, talk me through, like, how the heck do you get started with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll fast forward to how we do it today because
Okay,
we've
great.
evolved over these 5 years on how we approach it. But today, the process we go through when we're looking to present our opportunity or this offers to these land investors or the landowners, whoever has it at the time, we will go to there's public databases. Like if you go to any given county in the country, they will have a list of what properties are in the county and who owns it. Like that's the same for almost every county in the entire country. And so, because that is publicly available data, there are aggregators who go and collect all the data from all the counties everywhere, and they clean it up and make it consistent format wise. And because all these counties do it differently, right? They all have their own little rules. So these aggregators collect it all and standardize it, so it's easier for us to work with. And so we buy from these aggregators this data, right? So that we can go and just get it easily downloaded, and we can set criteria and say, I want properties that are between 5 and 10 acres, in these 4 counties in the state of Arizona or wherever. So we can go through and specify this. And we kind of cover large swaths of area at a time, but that allows you to go in and specify these criteria about what you want. And then they will send you the data and say, here's all the properties that meet your criteria. Here are the ownership records of who owns it and their mailing addresses, et cetera. And from there, we take the data and begin the process of formulating our offer for their given property. And we customize it as much as possible, like a per owner, per property basis.
Interesting. So, right. So, there clearly, the software exists to help facilitate it because, like you said, there are all these little thousands of jurisdictions across this very large country,
Yep.
and the data is not the same, et cetera, et cetera. So, right, they standardize it. And then that's where you come in and you have to figure out, okay, what exactly am I looking for? Because presumably there are like I said, I bought in some golf course community that might be of 0% interest to you, or that might be exactly what you target. And you might be looking for certain size properties or able to subdivide. Right? Like I'm just saying this off the top of my head, but
Yeah.
you can figure out exactly. And then it's like you said, also, you're optimizing for convenience and speed. And essentially what that means is you are probably going to offer, as you said, a lower price potentially. But if those people are looking for just a convenient close and it being fast, and they're willing to accept a little bit less for no headaches at all, well, then you're their guy in essence.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there's just so many different ways, even inside of land investing as a niche. Although the name investing is a little bit of a misnomer, like we just flip the land effectively, but that's the term we use, land investing. So inside of land investing space, there's several different subcategories, which we'll dive into all of them. But basically, the one that I focus on kind of fits my business best. I've determined what kind of business structure I want, like how many employees do I want, and what kind of things do we want to focus on, and what kind of conversations do we want to have, and depending on those factors, help us determine what kind of offer we make to them and what kind of properties we focus on and what kind of owners we want to speak to, right? And so it helps us kind of narrow everything down and stay in our lane, and that at the end of the day results in a much better product for them and a much better experience for them and for us. Right. And so we can kind of tailor our offering to what they actually want, which is, like I said, convenience and speed.
So now, again, I am very clouded with my own debacle in terms of land sometimes being incredibly illiquid and not being able to sell it even close to a quote unquote market value. So I get these postcards. I'm like, oh, that actually sounds pretty good. So like I'm probably your like ideal person. But that said, then you have to presumably turn it around and sell it for 2x, 3x, whatever the number is that you've determined fits your model in order for you to make money with all of the expenses of sending postcards and such. But there is clearly, with any type of real estate investing, there's some level of illiquidity if there isn't just this active market. And like, how do you consider that? Because that has to be critical, I would imagine.
Yeah, that illiquidity is the reason that this exists as an opportunity for me today, is because land is just a much less efficient market than houses. I mean, there are several factors, but that is one of the key ones in my opinion, because on any given house, you could sell it very easily on a market at near market prices, in general. right? You can maybe just a little below market and you can move it fairly quickly because there's such a common, established, easy to access marketplace across the country. Obviously, localized marketplaces, but these marketplaces exist, right? And they're readily accessible by everybody. Whereas with land, it is significantly more fractured. And so we have to list on several different sites to try and get to find the right buyer because there's just no single point where everyone's going to go to sell 90% of the deals. Like just isn't a thing for land. Additionally, the buyers are different kind of buyers. Like less than 5% of our transactions involve a loan from an outside party. Like vast majority of the transactions, not just on our side, we purchase all cash, but we sell to all cash buyers vast majority of the time because land's just not an attractive asset for a lot of lenders. And so there's not that many lenders that do it. And when you can find a loan, most people just don't want to. They'll just rather purchase it cash. And it also has to do with the price point, right? So typically it's under six figures for most of our land sales. There are exceptions to that, but even at the higher price points, we still find it's mostly cash transactions. And there's we also offer owner financing on our deals as well to kind of smooth those transitions if people want to do that. So that's another option that they have when they work with us. But that marketplace, because of its inefficiencies, like all these different levels, that creates space, that creates opportunity for us to say, hey, look, it may be difficult for you to sell this, and maybe it's difficult for us to sell it as well, but this is what we do all day, every day. It's our specialty, right? And so we're willing to take on the hassle and time and put it into our systems that we've invested a lot into to more efficiently sell it. So if you sell it to us at this discount, we'll make it really easy to remove it from your life and you can move on to other things. And then we will go handle the hassle of trying to get closer to market value, putting it through our own systems.
Okay, so these systems, I think when it comes to real estate investing, and again, that's a very broad term, real estate investing, right? There are 100 different ways you can approach real estate investing. But I think many people either want to invest very specifically around where they live or where they're very familiar with versus, hey, I want this to, and of course I'm saying this is like single family rentals, et cetera. Or I want to invest somewhere that's nowhere near me. I want to have a property manager and I don't want any of the headaches. I'm just thinking about this as a business. But when it comes to this land investing, because I would imagine the selling side, and this is my guess, and I'd love for you to corroborate or disagree entirely. My guess is the selling side is much more difficult than the purchasing side in the sense that on the purchasing side, obviously you have to go into the numbers, you figure out the offers, but at the end of the day, it's law of large numbers. If I send out 100,000 postcards, I'm probably going to get X number of conversions, et cetera. But then if you just did that across the country and knew nothing, you might get into a case where it's just wholly illiquid and you're just stuck with this thing. Now, again, this is armchair and I'm not a real estate investor, but that's just my intuition. I'd be curious your thoughts on that. And also then more importantly, like, do you focus on very particular areas that you have an expertise in? Or is this just, hey, my system would work or does work anywhere in the country?
Yeah, so let me break those down. So the focus between working with the seller of the property and us working with on the backside a buyer of this property are a little bit different. So when we go to purchase a property, that is actually probably where most of our focus goes because truly that is the core of our business. If we do not buy more property, we have nothing to sell,
sure.
Right? And so the biggest holdup there typically is systems and team, like how many transactions can you actually do at a high quality level without dropping the ball there, and two, capital, because we purchase everything cash. So there's a limit to like how much land we can buy. You know, if I send out 1 million letters a week, I could buy an incredible amount of land, but I do not have the team to support that, nor do I have the capital to buy that much land, right? So there's a balancing act. As you decide to scale that up, you kind of have to slowly figure that out, right? Like how much capital, how much team, how do I bring these together? On the backside, that is a slightly different dance because you already have the asset and you own it at typically around 50% of the current market value. And you're trying to determine what is the appropriate number that the market wants to buy it at. And houses have so much data on like how valuable something is. So you typically can like nail down a price pretty easily and within a very small margin of error. Land is not usually that simple. Every piece is unique and the common attributes, like they matter a lot sometimes. Like the same property on the same street could be worth 40% difference because of some critical components of that individual properties you're comparing. And so we always work in ranges. We say, I think it's worth between X and Y. Like it's always a range for us. And so we have to determine where in that range is the appropriate number that moves it quickly enough that we can liquidate and do it again without sitting on it for 5 years. Like there's a sweet spot in there. And so we have to find that number. And that's, you're getting feedback from the market. That's experience. That's the level of marketing and expertise. Like there's a lot that goes into like finding that right number, but that is a very much a different dance.
All right, JT. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So clearly there are systems on each side. And I guess my one question about that. So again, I'm going back to armchair, my college here of like, okay, offer and acceptance, right? So like if you send out a postcard and I don't know if your team sends out postcards with exact offers on them or not, but like if there is that offer and there's acceptance on the other side, like I think you have a legal contract at that point. But I'm curious, like how much diligence, because you're sending out thousands, tens of thousands of these postcards, like, but yet you're saying sometimes on one block, there could be a massive variance, right? Like, so how much is it just systems and data and this database and a little bit of knowledge and intuition versus like, okay, look, we've got to really dive into maybe if they come back and say they're interested, now we have to really do extra work. Like, is there that level of extra work after they get in touch with you? Like, talk me through that.
Yeah, that's a very intuitive question. So there are two big schools on the way this can be approached. And going back to my earlier comment about how you build your team and systems, one of the ways that you talked about, and one of the ways it's done, is this more what we call a neutral approach, right? Where you will send a letter. I send 2-page letters, by the way. So you send a letter or a postcard, and it basically says like, hey, I'm interested in buying your property. Like if you're interested in selling your property, call me and let's chat, right? And that's a very again, neutral approach, right? So that you're just looking for a conversation in that arrangement. Now, the plus side is you're going to get a lot more calls. More people are willing to have a chat about whatever it is the scenario is. The downside is that it's a lot more labor intensive because you have to have all these conversations, right? And talk to people and do the research and figure out whether or not you can make something work. My style is different. Mine is very data heavy. And both sides need a certain level of data discipline, but mine is like even more so because not only do I dial as tight as I can on who I am trying to contact, I also have to determine to the greatest degree possible what is the value of the property I'm sending, because I do send a one page, like the second page of my 2 pages is a draft contract that has an exact price on it.
Oh,
and
wow.
so, and we have had people just literally sign it, send it back, we countersign it, and the deal goes forward. Like it's that simple sometimes, but it basically gives them a really good sense. If you work with us, this is exactly what we're going to send you, right? And so they'll come back, and it's common for there to be some kind of negotiation on the price. Sometimes the price is right, sometimes we guess high, sometimes we guess low, whatever. We come to a final number, send them the finalized version, we both sign it and move forward. But that involves a little bit of a lot of upfront work. I mean, I had at the beginning of the year, we were doing a pricing round, and the guy in my team who was helping specialize in this and focus on that part of the process, it took months to price. And granted, we priced a lot of land at once, but we ended up with 6,500 lines of custom pricing, and those 6,500 lines were like, I don't want to deep dive too much in this. We can talk about this for an hour, but we basically have a way to say, okay, what's the smallest possible footprint without choosing a single property that we can get, and identify the price for that, right? Like in this given area, this acreage or whatever, like these characteristics, this is the price for that kind of thing. And then we have some custom code that kind of matches our pricing schema up with the individual properties and assigns a value to the price. And that's the number that gets printed on the letter that goes to them.
Interesting. Okay. I appreciate the clarification on that. And I committed the cardinal sin of interviewing before, of asking 2 questions at the same time. So I'm going to follow up with the second one that I asked before. And I'm glad we dove into the first one so much, which is, do you buy anywhere, or is it very specific? Like, hey, I live in Arizona, I know these 4 or 7 counties, and that's where I focus? Or is this something that could expand very easily if you had the capital? Because I think you said that's a constraint in the system as well.
Yes, absolutely. So there are lots of different ways to run the business, but for us specifically, we focus in 2 different states. And we've done deals in about a dozen states, kind of one-off deals, but those 2 states are where we spend most of our time and effort, because once you've established a marketplace, then you have a whole team and system in place. I've got a title agent that I use for the whole state, and she loves me, and I love working with her, and she's awesome, right? Like she helps me out all the time. And that kind of relationship is paramount for part of the system's success. right? And so I don't want to start that over in a bunch of different places all the time. So we build these systems and all the on the ground resource, everybody we need, so that anytime a deal comes through, you just put it right in the pipeline and everything gets taken care of all the way along the way. Anytime I go to a new market, I got to build a new pipeline. So I prefer to work in existing markets as much as possible. Now, we can expand to third, fourth, fifth states, and we probably will down the road once we feel like we've really tapped out and mastered our existing markets. But I think it's totally unnecessary, in my opinion, to spread out too wide too fast, because there's so much that's available inside one or two markets that can really do it. And just to be clear, our markets are like kind of, we do entire states at once with a few exclusions.
All right, JT, this is really cool. And it sounds like you've built systems over the last really handful of years at this point. You've got this down where, again, because we talked about, all right, there's some aspect of the conservative nature of five people for a lot of us. And it sounds like you're buying these properties in cash for 30 to 50% of the market value. So it's not like you're up at night of, can I pay the mortgage unless I can sell one of these properties in the next 30 days? So it sounds like you've built something that can perpetuate. And like I've kind of deduced here because of your knowledge of modeling and numbers, this is systems based, right? And it's replicable. And I'm curious if somebody's listening to this, because, again, this was more just like a fun dive into your story. But if somebody's listening to this and saying, oh, that sounds fascinating to me, that sounds like something I think that I could sink my teeth into. Are there resources? Like, how would somebody get started? Do you have resources, or where would somebody start in land investing generally?
Yeah, my biggest recommendations to anybody who asks how they can get into this space is, first and foremost, start off with some podcasts. I recommend guys over at Casual Fridays, REI. They have a solid podcast, especially the first kind of 50 episodes. It's kind of a little bit older at this point, but it will give you the basics. And they've got a solid podcast. And then the other one I recommend is RE Tipster, which I mentioned earlier, Seth Williams over at RE Tipster. His podcast is fantastic, and he has a lot of amazing resources on his blog. And he also has a really great course, which is reasonably affordable to just go in and kind of learn a lot about how this works.
Okay. And obviously, this is a question that doesn't have a specific answer, but based on your own kind of ramp up for this, like how many months of learning did you do? Was it just kind of all part and parcel of learning real estate in general, or like from inception to somebody's listening to this in July of 2023, August of 2023? You have any sense of like, okay, this is probably going to take you 6 months of learning, like this is intricate? Or, I mean, I know, again, weird question, but I'm curious.
Yeah, that is a difficult question to answer, because it really depends on where they're starting from, right? If they have experience running a business, then this will be a new version of business for them, and they can learn the systems and the application fairly quickly with a good course like Seth has. But if you've never run a business before, you will be learning to run a business, which is a whole different rodeo, right? If you've never done that before, then you're gonna be like, okay, how do I run a business? What's the point? What do I need to focus? What do I need to spend my time? Like, there's just so much to learn about business in general, and then how this particular business model runs. That will be a longer time horizon. And I've seen people like within a few months absolutely killing it, and with people who took a year or two to get rolling. And kind of like I floundered for a while, when I was doing it, but that's okay. Like, if you commit the time to get it right, then once you have it down, the system will just keep perpetually running, with your assistance.
I love that answer, and it goes back to the rubber ducks from before, right? It's this is a business, and if you think it's something mystical, magical because it's real estate, you're deluding yourself in essence. So, best possible answer you could have come up with. I absolutely love that. So, JT, this has been awesome, and I know you've been listening, like we said, for 6+ years, and I'm trying intermittently to bring back the hot seat, and I'm curious if you're up for some questions.
Love it. I love it.
Awesome. Let's do it.
In a world drowning in debt and rampant consumption, trapped by the chains of lifestyle inflation, these questions highlight the secrets of those who have broken free. Welcome to the Choose FI Hot Seat.
All right, JT, let's start with a podcast, blog, or book you've recently enjoyed. We used to make it your favorite of all time, but that's a little much. Anything jump out recently that you're enjoying?
I mentioned 4,000 Weeks earlier, but let me say for this year, I think my best book that I've read in the last 6 months, let's call it, is The Comfort Crisis. I forget the name of the author, but The Comfort Crisis was just a fascinating look at how making like one of the problems we face today is that so many people, all they do every day is figure out ways to remove discomfort from their life. And that is creating a problem. And how like strategically introducing some discomfort back in your life in a healthy way will actually improve your overall life satisfaction, mental state, just kind of across the board.
Yeah, I love that. And you are actually now the second person in the last week who's referred this to me. So the author is Michael Easter. And The Comfort Crisis, Embrace Discomfort to Reclaim Your Wild, Happy, Healthy Self. And I actually have this on hold at the library from the first person. So by the time this comes out, I will hopefully have read it. So that's a great one. All right, question number 2, an inflection point in your life that was especially memorable or meaningful.
I've mentioned a couple different inflection points in this conversation, but let me just share a little bit about one of those, a little more about one of those. So right when I went to quit my job, I was like, it was a multi-month process because of my position. I had to transition out into someone else to take over. And so during that whole time, I'm trying to determine, like, is this the right move? Like, can I make this jump? And so like it took a lot of reflection on there. But there was a particular moment in time where I'm sitting in the bathroom, like trying to figure out, like sitting against the wall, like next to the sink, just with my back against the wall, trying to figure out, like, oh man, this is the few quiet spaces in the house, right? So I'm like,
1,300 square feet with 6 of you?
That's right. Yes. So we're on this. I'm thinking, man, like, is this the point? Like, is this okay? Is it okay that I try this? Do I have what I need position wise? Like, can I make this happen? And my wife comes in and I ask her, is it okay if I make this change? Because I was so unsure of whether or not it was going to work. I thought it could work, but I couldn't guarantee it would work, right? And I needed her permission to like screw this up. I was like, I need you to tell me it's okay. Because like, I'm not sure it's going to be okay. I think it'll be fine. And she looked at me and said, I promised when we got married that we would live in a box if it needs to be. And that's okay if it happens again. Like if we screw this up and we go live in a box, I'm okay with that. And like, that's what I needed. I needed her to say like, it was going to be fine. And that was the point at which I thought, okay, it'll be, like, even if I completely screw this up for the next 2 years and we like lose hundreds of thousands, like it just messes it up, it'll be fine. Like it's going to be okay no matter what the circumstances are. Like finances are not the primary concern here. Like we will figure that out.
Wow. That level of support from your wife, that's incredible. I could hear the emotion in your voice, obviously, and the chills on my arm are a testament to goodness. That's incredible. I mean, that is the epitome of an inflection point in life. And it's amazing. The support she showed. That's remarkable for really what's important, right? Is you and your family. And if it meant a box, if it meant a 500 square foot, 1-bedroom apartment, all right, so be it. But we're together. That's amazing, my friend. All right. I guess let's go to question number 3. So I don't love this term, but I think you know where I'm going with this, which is your favorite life hack. And I think I talked about the library before. That's one of my favorites. Choose FI, Friends of the Library, we've long said. Or for me, Camel, Camel, Camel is one of my favorite ones on Amazon to track every single purchase you can make and get amazing deals. But anything jump to mind in the general life hack realm?
This is a little generic, but the life hack that comes to the front of my mind when we talk about that is a to-do list. Like I literally love my to-do list. It is the only way I keep my life organized. I use Google Calendar extensively, and I used to run my to-do list with Google Calendar reminders until recently. I've since moved to Todoist, but like just having a to-do list helps me keep my brain so free. Right? There's a system called GTD, Getting Things Done. And I don't follow that system exactly, but I'm probably 80% on that. And it just, every time something comes up and I'm like, man, I have this thing to do, I just, instead of trying to remember that I need to do it, or I brain dump it into my to-do list and then move on with life, because it gives me so much more mental space.
Man, you are speaking to my soul, my friend, because had I done a third one on the list of my favorite ones, it would have been that. And quite possibly that's actually number 1, to be fair, because same deal. And it's not that Todoist in and of itself is like something revolutionary. It's just an electronic to-do list, right?
Totally.
But what it actually lets you do is these recurring tasks. And I think that is what's so critical. And to your point, that mental space and freedom, that's the benefit. Because I don't think about the silly example that I always use is like when our passports need to be renewed. Right? Even if it's
totally.
8 years from now, because what I do is I'm 100% compliant with Todoist. So when I just recently received our new passports, I literally looked at the expiration date and then I updated my task in Todoist, whatever it is, 8, 9, 10 years in the future. And I know it's in there and I can trust it 100%. So yeah, I love that one.
Yeah, so much stress relief there.
Yeah, indeed. All right. So this used to be our quote unquote bonus question. I'm not sure why, but what purchase have you made in the last, let's say, 12 months or so that has added the most value to your life? Or just something fun? Anything you've bought recently that, just fun or interesting or something useful?
So I am at my core a huge anime nerd. I absolutely
Ooh.
love anime. Can't see it behind me, but my wall is filled with anime art. So one of the things my wife and I like to do from time to time is go to Anime Expo in LA. It's like the largest convention for anime in North America, and it's got this massive mecca of art. It's just hundreds and hundreds of art vendors there who all specialize in it and don't always sell easily online. So it's a great place to find art. The other reason we go there, along with the art, which we bought several pieces of when we went to the convention 2 weeks ago now, was we also I collect, and this is like the only thing I collect, but I collect original production cells, is what they're called. So pre 2000s, when animation was created, they basically had like a celluloid sheet that they would paint on, and that would become one frame effectively of the animation. And so they would have frame after frame of custom hand painted like celluloids. And so these cells you can find, like they are in the wild. People have saved them and like trade them and sell them. And so there are a very small collection of vendors who will sell these out and about. And a few of them go to Anime Expo. So I will go to Anime Expo and buy collections of them. And so I have these pre 2000 cells for some of my favorite animes of all time, one of which is on the wall behind me. I really love them. I think they're amazing. Like, it's the only piece of art besides anime art that I'm like, man, I just really love this. Something about it just really lights me up. And so I love being able to go and collect them. They're not inexpensive for the nice cells. It's usually in the thousands of dollars, but I just really like that item.
Huh. That is one of the coolest answers we've ever gotten on that question. I love it. That is absolutely cool. And yeah, I can see how it lights you up. That's awesome. All right, we'll do one more question. Do you have a future like goal travel destination, or maybe I don't know if you use travel rewards points or any kind of travel reward success or anything?
Yeah, so my family and I like to travel a few months a year internationally right now if we can. And so we've been to several different places for the last couple of years. I don't know that there's a single destination I could name. We have 10 years of travel planned out. Our next trip is probably back to Japan in 24. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm actually doing a precursor trip next month to hike Fuji. So
Are you kidding me?
yeah, it's going to be great. So we always kind of have a little travel planned here and there because I'm always looking forward to like the next thing, a few months down the road.
Oh my God, that's amazing. So obviously, I know you listen to the podcast. I don't imagine that anybody listens to every episode, but I have probably said to people who listen to every episode are probably sick and tired of me talking about wanting to hike Mount Fuji, that is like literally my life goal at this point. So I am hopefully doing that in 2024 if all goes well. So
That's
I'd love to
fantastic.
compare some notes with you when you get back.
Let's do it.
That's amazing. All right, JT, this has been awesome. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate you being a member of the community for so long. And this has been fun. So I guess if people are interested, I don't know if they can get in touch with you. I know you have a couple of websites and such, but where would you direct people?
Yeah, I'd say the best place to connect with me is probably just in the Choosify Facebook group. Reach out to me there. I'm a member there, so connect with me there. Otherwise, I mean, if they wanted to reach out directly, they can check out Olmstead.properties, the website. Like, there's a small contact form there. It's not a big deal, but if they want to hit me up, they can connect me there. But I'd say Choosify Facebook is probably the best.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds good. You've been an active member there from basically the inception. So yeah, again, really appreciate you being here. This has been a ton of fun.
Thanks for having me.